Good evening. Let's get started. Welcome to our lecture series on EU energy policy on the road to decarbonisation, question mark, to this second lecture evening of that lecture series that is organized by the Institute for European Studies at the Freie Universität Brüssel in cooperation with the Ecologic Institute in Berlin, WWF, and Climate Strategies. Last week, and I should also mention that we actually have support by the Jean Monnet Lifelong Learning Program of the European Commission. That always deserves mentioning. Last week we had the introduction into EU energy policy, focusing a lot on renewables policy. So this week we look at it from the other side, introducing the EU's climate policy acquis, I assume. Yes, there is it. And then discussing what perhaps the gaps are, what needs to happen in a 2050 decarbonisation perspective. I'm very happy that I can welcome three distinguished speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. The first one will be Stefan Verhoote of the European Commission's DG Klima. He's head of unit of the Unit on Strategy and Economic Assessment. Right? I hope that's correct. After that will be Jason Anderson of the of WWF, so the co-sponsor of the lecture series. He is the head of European Climate and Energy Policy of the WWF's European Policy Office here in Brussels. And the third one will be Jos Beekwilde, and he's the chair of the Environmental Policy Group of Digital Europe, which is representing the digital technology industry in Europe, Digital Europe. So I guess you may also want to say a few words about that, if you want. So let's get started with this lecture evening. I hope we can stick to about 20 minutes each, if that's possible, to reserve some time for discussion afterwards. So Stefan, can I invite you to present the EU's climate policy acquis?
Okay, thank you, Sebastian, and it's a pleasure to be here and to talk a bit about where we stand in terms of climate policy in Europe. I've put together a number of slides. I was not very sure what level of knowledge you already have about that, so I assumed, well, I have also some basic slides on the ETS and things like that. I will go through them to give you a bit of a flavor in total about European climate policy. I will not be able to go into much details on many of the issues relating, for instance, the ETS is quite a comprehensive topic on its own. I will give a few introductory remarks about that, on how we see that. But it's the intention to give you a bit of an overall overview of climate policy. And to start with, I hope that is clear enough. Yes. Perhaps it's interesting to see where do we stand today in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Because basically all this started with the Kyoto Protocol, which uses 1990 as a starting base. And what we see here is the dashed line is basically the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. And that is the line that goes down. And basically in 2010, our emissions, in terms of all greenhouse gas emissions which are covered by Kyoto, are about 15% below 1990. At the same time, the line that goes up is the GDP of the EU 27, and since 1990, basically the GDP of the EU 27 has grown by about 40%. So actually since the last 20 years, we have been able to decouple our emissions from economic growth. That's quite an interesting perspective. I think there's very few regions in the world who can say that. Of course, you can have long debates on the reasons why the evolution has been in the last 20 years, as you see it here today. Certainly, a number of issues are very prominent here. For instance, in the beginning of the 90s, the restructuring in Eastern Europe had quite a big impact on the emissions, and that has reduced emissions a couple of percentage points. And also you see very prominently in 2009, 2010, the economic crisis, where of course our economic sectors like steel and cement were very heavily impacted, and that has a major impact on emissions. But I think another lesson that we can learn is that also in years of economic growth, we were able to have no growth in emissions. And that is also partly the results of greenhouse gas policies, renewables policies, energy efficiency policies, and also to a certain extent, I would say, since 2005, for instance, from 2005 to 2008, emissions went down as well. And that was also a period where you had quite sharp increases in terms of fossil fuel prices, in particular oil and gas. And of course that kind of macroeconomic changes also has an impact on emissions. And that leads to autonomous reductions in itself, because of course people react to rising prices. Overall, the EU is on track to meet its 20% target. Of course, you all know, I guess, basically the targets that the EU has set for itself, the reduction of 20% by 2020 compared to 1990, with a proposal to go to 30% in the international negotiations if those would be sufficiently successful that other countries would follow suit sufficiently, and of course also a target of 20% renewables in final energy consumption. Those are two mandatory targets which are fully implemented in legislation. The third target is an improvement of energy efficiency of 20%, where we are basically not very much on track. You also can talk quite a lot about how this target is defined, because the other targets are quite simple. The energy efficiency target is a bit of a complicated one, because it's compared to an increasing baseline. So it's not an absolute reduction of 20% in energy consumption, but less than that. Okay. This is actually a slide from our roadmap, the low carbon roadmap, that a Commission communication that we made last year. But I wanted to show it first. I understand that next week you will have a complete lecture on that as well. But I wanted to show you basically two things. First of all, if you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, where are they actually? And this slide shows very nicely the important sectors that we have that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. The power sector is actually the most important one. So the production of electricity is of course contained of a mix of nuclear, coal, gas, renewable energy, but overall it's quite an important part. Secondly, residential, and tertiary is basically heating in buildings. So that's the energy we use to heat our homes and to heat our offices. Industry is a third part. A fourth part is transport, and what you can see in transport, of course, it's if you see the evolution between 1990 and 2010, which are historic data, that's the sector that stands out a bit, because that's the sector which has been growing in emissions. So we have problems in the transport sector, especially because mobility increases all the time, and personal mobility increases all the time, and efficiency improvements so far have not been able to catch up with growing demand for transport. Then you have agriculture, which basically emits non-CO2 emissions, methane and N2O, which constitutes about 10% of emissions. And that is linked to livestock and is linked to the use of fertilizer, mainly. And then you have a residual other non-CO2 emissions, like HFCs, which replace ozone-depleting substances and things like that. So that's, we can go into details on this low carbon roadmap, what it shows in terms of how that changes over time. But what this slide shows is, of course, on the one hand the current policy, but it also shows actually the major challenge that we are faced with, because if we are to be consistent with 2 degrees, it basically means that in 2050 we can only achieve an 80% reduction of our total energy system, which is a huge challenge, because of course we all know that fossil fuels are the backbone of our energy system, whether it's coal, gas, oil for transport, all very important. And it shows of course the challenge and why there is so much discussion about this, how to achieve that kind of reduction scenarios. Now, going more into into the discussion of what do we have in place, and this is actually a slide that gives a significant part of the legislation that is in place, and that was all adopted end of 2008, which is the so-called Energy and Climate Package. And there's a lot to say about that, of course, on how that was all brought together. At some point in time, basically we had, of course, first the Kyoto Protocol and the setup of the ETS, but during 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, there were a number of developments that eventually led to the adoption of this package. One of them being an increasing awareness relating to climate change. The fourth assessment report of the IPCC came out. There was increasing awareness also among the public. Remember the Al Gore film. There were also a situation, that was the time when fossil fuel prices, oil prices, gas prices went up, and there was increasing concern about what this means in terms of our economic system. And of course there were a number of policy developments. For instance, we already had a Renewable Energy Directive on electricity that was applicable to 2010. We had a Biofuels Directive which was also applicable to 2010. Both had indicative targets, so there was a discussion going on regarding what is the future of renewable energy policy. And there was also a discussion going on the ETS. At some point in 2005, 2006, the discussion on the windfall profits relating to free allocation in the ETS of the electricity sector came up, which created a lot of discussions with stakeholders. Is this correct? Should that be the way we go forward? So a lot of actually independent developments, but which all accumulated in a lot of preparatory policy papers, which eventually led to a situation that in 2007 the Commission proposed two targets, 20% greenhouse gas emissions and 20% renewables, as the key targets for 2020, which then subsequently was taken up under the German presidency in 2007, which these targets were then endorsed by the European Council and by the Parliament, with an invitation to the Commission to actually put the legislation in place to adopt those targets, to have the measures in place to reach those targets. And that led to a number of policy proposals from the Commission. The two central ones from the side of the on climate change in particular was the ETS and the efficiency decision. Now that was already a fundamental change compared to the Kyoto system. The Kyoto system, each national country had a target and had to fulfill it itself, basically. In the ETS, partially through national allocation plans. But this was a new concept because it basically said the ETS is a system that governs the industrial sectors in Europe in a uniform way. So we don't need national targets there. We need an overall cap that governs those sectors in a consistent way, in a harmonized way. And on the other hand, we have the residual sectors, transport, housing, small businesses and agriculture, which are governed by the effort sharing decision. And those are also sectors, small scale emitters, where we thought it's also useful that member states put the policies in place together with EU policies, so that it's useful for them to have a national target and that they have an obligation under the EU law to reach a certain target. So those were, from the EU perspective, the two central components in terms of the package. There were a number of other initiatives. Most important one, I would say, the Renewable Energy Directive, because there as well the 20% target had to be shared between the member states. A second one was the Fuel Quality Directive, which looks basically at the supply of transport fuels, where also an obligation regarding CO2 reduction was enshrined. That was also an interesting perspective because how that was played out within the Commission, in the sense that the Renewable Energy Directive incentivizes biofuels and the Fuel Quality Directive as well. But the Fuel Quality Directive is more directed to an end result, a performance for biofuels, because it puts an obligation on CO2 reductions, not on the amount of biofuels. And that also was a big discussion inside the Commission and then subsequently in the Council and the Parliament on how those two interact, and the whole discussion on sustainability criteria was actually inserted in both directives. Then another one was carbon capture and storage, which is basically a directive which enables member states to put in place regulation to ensure safe carbon capture and storage. So it doesn't put targets, but it's a regulatory system that member states need to put a regulatory system in place if carbon capture and storage technologies would be used, that this is done in a safe way with good storage, with a good storage system. It was also a way to try and get more public acceptance. Of course, if something is unregulated, the resistance from the public can of course be bigger, because what does it mean? Is there going to be leakage? So the CCS directive is a way to try to address those concerns and to put in place regulation in order to in order to have safe storage. And finally, a third one that is very important, I would say, in terms of instruments next to the ETS and renewables, which is the CO2 and cars legislation. Before we had a voluntary agreement, where also in the period 2004, 2005, 2006, it became clear that this was not delivering, that the voluntary agreement was not sufficiently delivering, and there was a decision to go for regulation with a target of 135 grams of CO2 in 2015 and a provisional targets of 95 grams per kilometer in 2020, which is now actually a new proposal to define exactly the modalities. Quite interesting, I would say, because if you compare that to 1995, the 95 grams means about a doubling of the efficiency of cars compared to basically 1995. Now, the targets as such were at the time not so much contested, because basically you have a situation that the European Council and the Parliament endorsed the targets. The big question was then, and it was difficult for member states to say, well, we don't like our own target, because if somebody was challenging his targets, it would mean that somebody else would need to do more. So in the negotiations, and one of the big achievements of the package was that basically the targets that were proposed by the Commissions were unchallenged, and it was impossible for member states or the Parliament to disentangle this integrated approach. But the whole discussion was, of course, on the one hand, the division between ETS and non-ETS, and there we have a system that, compared to 2005, the reduction would be minus 21 in the ETS and minus 10 only in the non-ETS. There was huge discussion on whether this was fair, and one of the issues that we did in the economic analysis of that package was to try and identify the costs per member states. And when we did the analysis, when we said, well, let's distribute the targets as if the effort is the same for everyone with let's say an equal carbon price, then you saw that especially the new member states, the costs per GDP was higher in the new member states. And that created, of course, a problem, because the countries who are less wealthy would need to do a bigger effort. So there were, inside the package, different mechanisms were enshrined to compensate the new member states for this intrinsic higher costs. And that was done in three ways. In the non-ETS, to have somewhat less ambitious targets for the new member states. On the renewable side, also to have a bit less ambitious targets for the new member states. And thirdly, the auctioning, we went into a system of auctioning or partial auctioning for the power sector in the ETS, which brings revenues to the member states. And there's a mechanism built in that a certain part, about 12% of those revenues, would be reallocated between the member states. So from the richer member states, part of the money would be dedicated to the poorer member states. And that also worked quite well. There were a lot of discussions around it, but there were some changes made to that, but all in all, relatively small. And this shows the targets for the non-ETS, and the targets were set basically on GDP per capita figures. So the poorer member states have the targets in the non-ETS of plus 20% maximum, and as a function of GDP per capita, this goes to minus 20 for the richest member states. That created also quite some consensus around the table, because countries that are similar, let's say for instance Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, UK, which all have a similar economic development, have similar targets. It also enables the poorer member states, for instance Bulgaria, Romania, who you see when you do the economic analysis, you expect their transport sector to grow. Of course, there is some kind of saturation in the richer member states in terms of mobility growth, but that is still very much ongoing in the old member states. As they get richer, there's more mobility. So it also creates some room for maneuver to allow that growth. If they would have very tough targets, it would simply mean that they can never have the same kind of mobility as there is in Western Europe. Then a few words on the carbon market. Basically, the ETS is a system that tries to do two things. First of all, it tries to reduce emissions, and it ensures through the cap of allowing a certain amount of allowances, a certain amount of emissions by the industrial sectors, that that level of emissions is reached. And because it is a trading system, it ensures in a way that this is done in a cost-effective way and in a flexible way. It is up to the regulator to determine the cap. That is what happens in co-decision. And there is a system to distribute the allowances across the sectors. And in the system as it is as of 2013, basically the power sector needs to buy their allowances, so they have to pay for every allowances they purchase. While for the industrial sectors, there's largely a system of free allocation. Now, why this difference? The second big discussion next to the distribution between the member states, the second big question was the question of competitiveness and carbon leakage. A lot of industrial sectors claim that they are exposed to a global market, of course. When you talk about steel, about chemicals, they are traded on a global market, and they claimed that if they are confronted with extra costs in Europe, which are not applying in other countries, that this extra cost would affect their competitiveness and in fact could lead to delocalization. And the next step is then, the question is, if delocalization happens, if the plants in, let's say, China or the US who make up for that production, if they are actually more efficient or less efficient than ours. So if they are less efficient, it actually doesn't reduce emissions, it does displace emissions to other countries. So that was a huge discussion. And one of the means to, let's say, try to tackle the risk for carbon leakage, our analysis was showing that those risks were limited at the prices we were expecting, and even much more so in a situation where we have very low carbon prices as we have today. That with a system of free allocation, that would help the energy intensive industries, but that was a big discussion inside the co-decision procedure. So a bit further information: the ETS system covers about half of the CO2 emissions in Europe. The big thing, of course, about it is that it treats industries and the power sector in a uniform way across Europe. And that's a real asset, I think, in terms of the European climate policy. Just imagine that we would have a situation where every member state has to regulate these sectors on its own. That would create huge problems, could create huge distortions of competition. So the fact that we have an ETS system is a major advantage, I think, in Europe, that we have a system that is EU-wide with one carbon price for a whole range of sectors. This shows basically the trajectory in terms of the cap. So we have a gradual reduction of the cap over time, with a linear reduction of 1.74% of allowances each year. So every year in the system there's about, the emissions in Europe were in 2008 about 2.1 billion tons of CO2. The trajectory, the cap basically goes down every year by about 40 million tons. And that gradually increases the scarcity in the system. Now, when we did the package 4 years ago, we were projecting in our analysis a carbon price of 30 euros And what we are today, where we are today, is of course completely different. So today there is a huge discussion going on the ETS, if it needs to be reformed, what needs to be improved. Because what happened between when the package was adopted and today was a major economic crisis, a crisis we haven't seen since 50 years basically, and that had a huge impact on itself, on the emissions, and basically while we were thinking that there was an important scarcity in the market, which would lead to a carbon price that can drive low carbon investments, has completely reversed the situation. Emissions are below the cap, and that basically a surplus is growing. Basically the market is not short, and what you see here is the graph of how the emissions evolved since 2008. In 2008 they were quite high. Then the economic crisis kicked in at the end of 2008, and the prices went down. And as such, that's one of the attributes of the ETS, that it adapts flexibly to economic cycles. When there is an economic crisis, it's good that companies have to pay less, and the ETS adapts to that. But after 2011, when basically the prices had stabilized for 2 years, another effect kicked in and the prices went down further. And one of the reasons for that is basically that the transition from phase 2, in which we are today, to phase 3, in which we will be as of 2013, implies a number of changes that brings extra allowances on the market, and also especially brings extra CDM credits are brought forward or brought into the market more rapidly. So we think that this surplus that has been built into the market will even accelerate in the next 1.5 years. And that creates a whole question, a whole debate in Europe about what should we do about this. Can we leave the market alone? The market functions. If it's achieved if a certain cap is achieved through a lower price, that's perfect. Others are saying, well, basically this is a problem because it does not drive low carbon investments, and more fundamentally it questions the system in itself. And I think that's a very important discussion, because you see here and there in countries, the ETS system basically brought the countries together under one system. You see more and more divergence across member states, that some people say we want to do more, we want to introduce a price floor in our country. Others are saying we need to do less. I'm not prepared, we need to have other policies. So a fragmentation of policy is at risk basically. Yes, I have a few more slides on renewables, but I understand you went into that in more detail last week.
Yeah, can be brief, yeah.
So here you see basically the targets. So I guess that was tackled last week. Of course, important as well is we have many energy efficiency policies, the CO2 and cars. Energy efficiency standards I think are also quite important. There's now a whole set of energy efficiency standards which can address market failures. So I think those are very much complementary to a market-based systems, that we have certain policies, command and control, that also help to address specific products. We have the Energy Efficiency Directive, but here as well I would say a lot of the discussion on the future will be about the interaction of policies. How does renewable policies, the ETS and energy efficiency policies, how do they go together? I think that's one debate also for the future. Perhaps more than we have certain policy gaps. I think we have many policies in place, but the interaction of policies I think is, and of course the ambition level of policies is the key question for the future, because the policies we have in place today are of course also not sufficient to meet the first slide that I showed with the low carbon roadmap. The question is, what after 2020? Can we still do something more before 2020? Those are all discussions that are ongoing. And finally, in terms of policy gaps, I think an interesting thing that is going on today is the question of the EU budget. The EU budget is currently in negotiations, and the Commission proposed actually a major effort to mainstream climate policy in all policies that the EU has, whether it's cohesion funds, agriculture, research. All those policies are very important, And there's a big exercise going on, how can we integrate energy and climate change in those policies? The Commission proposed basically that we should have 20% of the budget, so over the period of 8 years, 200 billion euros spent on research, cohesion money, linked to those issues, which is quite remarkable. So it's also relating to infrastructure. That's perhaps another point that is still, in terms of policy gap, another issue that I would like to emphasize is the question of the networks. Renewable energies mean a major change in how the networks, especially the electricity network, works. So the integration of renewables puts more questions than just more renewables, but how does that all work together in an energy market? How does it all work on how the network works? Okay, I'll leave it here.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Stefan, for this overview that has also already, I think, implicitly raised a number of issues like, perhaps the others will comment on that, the ETS being traditionally the centerpiece of EU climate policy, and whether that is actually sufficient to give the long-term signals to market players that they need. But I expect that we'll touch upon this later on. So the next one to build on this presentation, I guess, would be Jason Anderson.
Very much, and thanks for the introductory talk, which gave a very good overview of the climate policy acquis. Coming from WWF, obviously our interest is ensuring that we have climate and energy policies that match up with the kinds of changes we need to see to stay within environmental limits. And I think it shouldn't surprise you to learn that we find that there are some gaps, both in current policy and in what looks like being the development of future policy. But I'm happy to see that we're not the only people who consider climate change to be such an important issue. This is our beloved Commission President, José Manuel Barroso, who said that climate change is the defining issue of our generation and the most existential of challenges. And we certainly agree with him. And as a result of his vaunted position, we would expect that he and other leaders would be leading a political charge commensurate with this challenge. You'll note that this statement is a couple of years ago, and since then he's been slightly distracted, let's put it that way. We haven't seen quite the kind of action that we might like to see. And actually, Stefan gave a very good description of the dynamic in the past that led to the climate and energy package. It wasn't a case of the Commission threw something out on the table and there was co-decision and voila. It was a long process that included, I remember during the UK presidency of the Council, there was a scientific congress that brought a lot of people together to talk about the advances in climate science in 2005. In 2000, that led up to the German presidency in 2007. The Council endorsed the Commission's set of think pieces that it had put on the table that led to the development of legislation, which was agreed finally at the end of 2008. It was a years-long process which had a lot of political buy-in, and it had this overarching pressure from the international negotiations. There was a sense of forward movement. I remember being in rooms where people said, how are we ever going to reach our Kyoto commitment of -8% in the commitment period among the EU 15? And as you'll see shortly, we've blown completely past that. We're doing much better than we anticipated at the time. But it was real pressure. Now, over the past couple of years, ever since Copenhagen ended with much of a fizzle, the UN conference at the end of 2009, which a lot of people had built up to be this kind of grand meeting that would solve the whole climate thing. If you listened in the media, even the popular media was billing it that way. Of course, anybody who is inside the negotiations on the way up would tell you that that's not really what it looked like leading to, and it certainly didn't. And one of the difficulty was that Europe had sort of set itself up by having this conditional target of 20% greenhouse gas reductions for certain, but will do -30% if other countries will come together in an international agreement and do something similar in scale. Now what that meant was that when that international agreement didn't emerge in Copenhagen, people started to ask themselves, what's the nature of that commitment now? What does that mean for us? Do we have to wait around until the next time we get together and there will be an agreement? And by the way, what does it mean to say that other countries have to do something similar? Like, what's the metric by which you measure what they're doing? It became very fraught. And so for a couple of years, one of the main things that people, well, organizations like mine were doing was saying, well, let's look at the merits of going to a minus 30% target on its own without considering the international, the UN situation. And study after study came out saying that actually Europe's economy would benefit from the move to minus 30%. Among other reasons, because it would help support these growing industries in renewables and efficiency, where we're seeing a lot of international competition. And oh, by the way, China might not have a top-down target the way the EU does, but it has a lot of other measures that it's doing, including investment in those clean industries. So we have a very difficult apples and pears problem when we're trying to make these comparisons. But it was impossible to make much movement. And one of the things that the Commission did was it said, there's two problems. We can't make much progress on the 2020 target now, and we know that 2020, from the perspective of investors in clean energy, for example, is really right around the corner. So let's start to think about the longer term. And 2050 and roadmaps for 2050 became the big issue in the past couple of years. And Stefan already showed you one of the results of the climate roadmap. Now, there were a set of milestones indicated in that for 2020, 30, 40, and 50, which would be the least cost trajectory to reaching minus 80% by 2050. Those milestones were put forward to the European Council in the process by which they look at what the Commission has said and they issue conclusions, which are basically a kind of endorsement or perhaps a call for further action by the Commission. In June of 2011, the Council was unable to come to agreement to endorse those milestones because Poland objected. There was essentially what they called a veto. In March of 2012, they were put forward again by the Danish presidency, and again Poland vetoed. And then there was an energy roadmap, which Poland vetoed in June of this year. Now the interesting thing about that is that, for one thing that it did was it put a damper on the kind of momentum that we might have seen coming out of this process of roadmaps, where we had a rational analysis trying to give us some information about what's the best thing to do to reach reductions, and one country was able to stand in the way of that. The strange thing about that is that there is actually no process for putting vetoes in place in the Council. It's not actually following the law. The law says that you're supposed to use the procedure by which the legal instruments that came out of that would actually be put in place. So, for example, if the Council were involved in a discussion about what to do to the ETS, that's agreed by qualified majority voting. So in fact, the Council should have voted by qualified majority. The veto doesn't really exist. So there's a problem here, and that's something that we're working on. We're hoping that we'll see in future that the Council doesn't let itself get blocked by a single member state in an illegal fashion. Now, we've already seen some of the successes that we've had to date, so it's not all doom and gloom. There are real emissions reductions happening in Europe. This slide here is, I think, maybe 1 year projected forward from the last one. In the EU 27, at the end of 2011, the estimate is that we were down by 17.5%, and in the EU 15, minus 14.1. It's broken out still by the EU 15 because of that Kyoto commitment still existing from before there was the EU 27. So we're well on track, and we had a big reduction here, which is largely due to the economic downturn, but not only. There's actually a reducing trend, the downward trend, before the economic downturn came into place. Now, one of the big problems that we face right now is that the EU ETS, which covers half of the economy and is broadly thought of as sort of the flagship policy from the EU, is having a lot of difficulty coping with this situation, as Stefan said. We've recently commissioned analysis from the Eco Institute in Germany, and what they found was that there's basically 2 billion extra tons floating around in the system, which is roughly to 1 year's emissions from the entire system of extra credit. And the way the analysis breaks down is the following. You've got historical use of CDM and JI credits, which free up EUAs, so you can bank those. You have the effects of the crisis, maybe 400 million tons, and there's very likely to be about, well, a gigaton, slightly more, of CDM and JI credits that might be brought into the system by the end of 2013. Now, that's what's building up to the 2,000 million units. There will be some drawdown of that by the inclusion of aviation in the EU ETS, and some more from demand from stationary sectors, but that leads to around 1.5 gigatons of extra credit. Now, the next slide has lots of lines on it. I'm going to ask you to look at just one line. I'll show you which one it is. It's this red line on the outside. Those 2,000 million tons at the top here, where we are right now, won't actually work out of the system until about halfway through 2023. 0 represents scarcity. 0 represents the point between where you have excess and where you have scarcity in the market. And we all know that the definition of a market, the definition of economy, is that there's something called scarcity. That's why we don't have a market for leaves off of trees, because there's no scarcity. If anybody reads Douglas Adams, that becomes a lot more funny. But if you have, and that's the same problem here. I saw a presentation by Mark Lewis of Deutsche Bank this morning, where Josko Beke, the Director General of Climate Action, was as well. And he said, you know, it's kind of a wonder we have a positive price at all, because there's all these tons in the system. And part of the reason why there is a positive price is that there's a certain level of confidence in the European Commission, in the EU system, to say we're not going to give up on this. We're not going to give up on the ETS, and we're not going to give up on European climate policy. They have some future perspective of solutions coming into place. And one of the short-term solutions that is being debated right now is to do something called backloading, which is you take out some number of tons to be revealed to us in the near future by the Commission, and maybe we'll stick them in the system later. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of insight to know that that doesn't have any environmental impact, because you're just taking the tons out early and moving them later. You might have some impact on the carbon price. I've seen an estimate of about €0.5 a ton. So it's not actually a super measure all on its own. What we've been looking at is a slightly longer term problem. You have to deal with the short term problem of these excess tons by taking them out and hopefully removing them entirely. But then we've got this problem on the next slide, which is that the 1.74% linear reduction factor year on year that Stefan showed us, if you project that out to 2050, the ETS only reduces to minus 71%, approximately. Now, that's a problem, because if you look at the Commission's own analysis, this is the slide that Stefan showed earlier, the entire economy has to be at minus 80%. And if you look at the sectors that are covered in the EU ETS, they should be in the 90s, and in fact it averages out to about up to minus 96%. So you can see there's a big difference between minus 71% and minus 96% if you want to be on this trajectory. So what that means is that we'll have to take tons out now to instill confidence that we even have a market. Those tons will eventually have to be taken off the system, and we have to change that linear reduction factor, and there's some debate about what that might be. Let's say instead of 1.74%, minus 2.5%, even above 3% has been floated. Now, what's the problem with that? The problem is that, as I said, there's not a lot of political will right now to do anything really large and meaningful to the system. Backloading is something that the Commission had hoped to be able to do through comitology, very much under its own control. They got a lot of pushback about the legal ramifications and have a one-line amendment to the directive as a decision that they hope to get through co-decision as fast as humanly possible. Parliament's not being particularly helpful in that regard. They could move it a little faster, but it's hopefully that's, from the Commission's point of view, that's a limited endeavor. What if you wanted to come back as we do and say, wait a minute, this system has some pretty fundamental flaws. Can we actually make some real changes to it? We need to see that. Well, the fact of the matter is that under the current political circumstances, I can understand that the Commission would be a little bit wary about their chance of success. And our job is actually to make people want to do it. And hopefully we'll have some success in that. Now, I can't get through a discussion on climate policy without talking about energy policy, because they are linked together in a package, and they will be intimately linked into the future. There was also the EU energy roadmap. The EU energy roadmap put out a number of scenarios, including a, if you will, a reference or baseline scenario, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 alternative scenarios using different combinations of technologies. There's a couple of things that I'd like you to notice about this. First of which is look at the overall demand of the economy in all of their alternative scenarios. It's quite a bit lower. It's quite a bit lower, like the Commission suddenly turned into NGOs. It's that good. It's a pretty sensible way of thinking about the future, because if you don't reduce the amount of energy that you need to supply, then you have a real conundrum about how are you going to reduce carbon, how are you going to meet that energy supply in the lowest possible cost way. The other point that is interesting to note is that these are the costs. They're broken by a decade, but these are the costs of all of the different scenarios, including the reference scenario. I think you would agree that these bars look almost identical. So the cost for all of these scenarios, the reference where you're continuing to use fossil fuels, nuclear, etc., and all of these decarbonization scenarios are about the same. What does that mean? That means that decarbonization is free compared to the baseline. Everything costs. But compared to what we would do without policy to rapidly decarbonize the economy, the system-wide costs are basically zero additional cost for decarbonization. That's a very strong message coming out of the European Commission. Now, we have some difficulties with the roadmap, and I remember sitting in Stefan's office months and months ago. A lot of people come through his office, so he probably doesn't remember this conversation. Being a little concerned about the goals that the Commission has set out for itself, namely a reduction of 80%. Now, the Council has said 80 to 95%. And if you look at what that means, you can have a debate about, well, maybe we do 80% and we buy some credits from elsewhere. In the back of your mind should be this slide we saw about those credits that have been coming in from overseas and ruining the ETS now. What would that mean for the future? So what we've done is we've done some analyses looking at what it would take to reach those 95% cuts. And I'll skip past a couple here, but what you find is that in the remaining 20% of the Commission's 80%, you end up with a couple of pretty tough to deal with sectors, including transport. That's the yellow bar. So about half of that remaining reduction would have to come from transport. You also see industry, and a lot of this isn't big industry, but small industry. And transport and small industry are quite difficult to reduce. And some of the solutions that you might see floated for reductions like carbon capture and storage are also harder to imagine, for example, in small industry in particular. And what we've been arguing is that this gives us some pause to think about what's the difference between aiming for 80% now and aiming for 95% now. Because it might have a significant change to the kinds of policies you set out now for the long term. I'll get back to that in a moment. We've come out with a publication. This is a screenshot of our website. At the end of 2010 and again at the end of last year, we worked with Ecofis to develop this thing called the Climate Policy Tracker. And what this does is it looks in great detail at all of the climate and energy policies of all of the member states of the European Union and discusses them and then rates them and then comes up with an aggregate rating of all of the countries in the EU and tries to give you a sense of whether or not the countries are on track to 95% decarbonization by 2050. And we did an A to G labeling system because it mirrors the energy efficiency labels on refrigerators and so forth, and hopefully it was easy to understand. What we found is only a few countries were even at a D. And I don't think anybody here would buy a D-labeled refrigerator. So it showed that we had quite a little work to do in the EU. And a number of countries were lower. Now, what we did in this analysis was try to look at those areas where there were gaps in policies. And I think that's relevant to talk about today. A number of things that this report threw up which is completely independent of the analysis I showed you about the energy roadmap. It was interesting because what did they say? We have gaps in industry and transport policy. So that recurs. And there are gaps of different kinds. Redesign of products, energy efficiency in industry, and obviously the cap on the emissions trading system not being ambitious enough. In terms of transport, the newly agreed caps for cars is good, and that system is working, but it's not enough. We need to look at freight transport, and we need to have a better understanding of how to actually achieve modal shifts, so you get people out of private cars into public transport, for example. We also looked at the difference from year to year between 2010 and 2011, and a lot of countries went backwards, unfortunately. Some went forwards, but there was a lot of standstills as well. We looked at sectors, including general, so things like, do a lot of countries have long-term visions, like Denmark's vision, for example, which is quite progressive in that regard. And this was a year characterized by some things like pulling out of support for renewable energy. And Spain was a dramatic case where they basically zeroed out their very successful support schemes. Now you can argue that they had been over-subsidized, but I think we could probably also say that zero is under-subsidization if you actually want to grow a new industry. We found that industry is still barely tackled in a lot of these policies. And importantly, that huge wedge that Stefan showed of residential and tertiary emissions, a lot of that comes from heating buildings. We had a very tepid approach to the new energy efficiency directive to deal with renovation of existing buildings. And that will remain a big gap unless we're able to make some improvements there. So finally, just to give you a sense of some of the conclusions of this report, again, the average score for EU-wide policies, so not member state by member state, but EU-wide policies, was also not scintillating, largely because we were having a 2050 vision and very little was in place for the longer term. Renewables policy has been more successful than, for example, energy efficiency policy. We look like maybe meeting the 20% renewable energy target. Now, all of this stuff you could read on the website, what all of these symbols mean, but one of the things we wanted to do was characterize the European policy for its different characteristics, including how restrictive it was, how loose it was, how much flexibility it allowed member states. And we came up with this contradiction, which was that some of the best policies were like the eco-design and emissions trading system, where you actually had quite a bit of control over what happens in countries, because eco-design allows you to ratchet up standards and everybody has to buy a more efficient appliance. And that's a good thing. The emissions trading system, in theory, works with a very simple mechanism to reduce and create emissions and create certainty about those reductions. The problem is that if you have a certain system that is certainly too weak, then what you put in place is a too-weak system for certain. And that's an example of what's happening there. And we see that there are some things not yet covered, or at least not well covered by EU policy. Targets beyond 2020 is an obvious one. We think a package approach for the future is still necessary. Electricity grids we're only getting now with the Connecting Europe facility, some additional funding under the new budget, and projects of common interest as well. The redesign of products and thinking about the whole efficiency of the chain. Again, resource efficiency is a big issue to Commissioner Potočnik, Environment Commissioner, but hasn't really filtered into European policy very effectively. Energy efficiency building, of industry, retrofits of building, freight transport, and low carbon agriculture. Every time the Common Agricultural Policy comes up for review, organizations like ours spend all kinds of time trying to say, wouldn't it be more rational if you did this and this and this with your money? And it's like banging your head against a wall. It's among the hardest policies to actually change and let people see what the impacts of agriculture policy are on climate change. Now, there's a lot of other things I could talk about gaps, some of which the Commission is actually starting to address right now. And those relate, but we could well talk about bioenergy and the proper accounting for the emissions from bioenergy. But if that's of interest to people, perhaps we could pick it up in discussion. So I will leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jason, for that. I think a lot of substance in there. I'm very happy that you brought up the 95% because indeed the political commitment is to 80 to 95%, and if my maths are correct, then I think 95 basically means everything to zero except agriculture. I don't know, that's about it, no? Because agriculture is very difficult to
or even no agriculture.
So thanks very much for that. Targets beyond 2020. We just heard last week, I think, also that there's no renewables proposal in the making for the coming year or so. So which probably means before the next elections, will probably not be a proposal. So yes, it all fits together nicely, these lectures. So I'm very happy that we now have also an industry voice. Obviously, the digital industry, which I would assume has a slightly different angle to it than other industries may have. But thanks very much for coming, Jos. I get your presentation up here, and then the floor is yours, Digital Europe.
First of all, thank you for inviting us to speak here. Indeed, we have a very different angle. My talk will be completely different, if only because we are not in the emission trading system. A minor reason, but it's completely. First of all, a little introduction. My name is Jos Bikholder. I am the chairman. I'm speaking as the chairman of the Environmental Policy Group of Digital Europe. I'll explain what that is. It's not my regular job. It's like 20-25% of my time. What I'm doing here, my daily job is with OC, a Dutch printer manufacturer, part of the Canon Group. So basically, I'm an engineer trying to mingle with public affairs. Digital Europe, what is it? It is the industry association for the digital industry. Digital industry is a bit of a broad word. We used to call ourselves the Information, Communication and Technology and Consumer Electronics Association. We have like 60 multinational industry members, ranging from equipment manufacturers like mine to software manufacturers like the most famous brands in the world. You see products of our industry all over the place. So we make stuff as an industry. Apart from the 60 multinational companies, we also have 40 national trade associations representing national associations of smaller, usually SME size IT companies all over Europe and the European Economic Area. So that's what we do. What we do is we represent our interests in the public arena, mostly in Brussels. We have a number of policy groups. The environmental policy group is one of them. We also have a trade policy group, a standards policy group, and a digital economy policy group, at a wholly different angle to things. What will I be talking about? Not about ETS, I can promise you. I will be talking about carbon footprinting. It's the most closely related thing to decarbonisation that I can imagine. Carbon footprinting, greenhouse gas emissions, but also a lot about energy efficiency. Not about energy efficiency of the economy, but the energy efficiency of products and software. My aim is not to advocate more policies, more regulations, but to advocate a balanced approach. Different policy instruments, I think we need to stimulate the decarbonisation, which is a target that we fully support. And the challenge is to strike this right balance. Okay, let me...
In this direction of the computer. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. First of all, a little bit further introduction. Information communication technology is everywhere, not just in this room, but in your house, in every place that you go to in your everyday life. Not just in a relatively advanced member states like Belgium, but also in all other 26 member states in Europe. I would say all over the world. Did you know that in Africa everybody owns a mobile phone today? That's information technology. It's everywhere. So look at where we are. We are in office buildings, in traffic transportation, important sector we heard, even I think in agriculture, on farms we are. So we are omnipresent. We prefer to say that our technology is pervasive, it's ubiquitous, and it's changing the way that we live, the way that we communicate. It's changing the professional part of our lives, your lives. It's making them more efficient, more productive. This is being done by means of products and software. The products are becoming more and more compact, smaller and smaller and do more and more tasks at the same time. Did you know that the last generation of iPhones, not the current but the previous generation of iPhones, had the same, or the smartphones I should say, had the same calculation power as all computers together in Space Shuttle? Did you know this? Space Shuttle is old technology, of course, but we shrank all this into a smartphone. The bigger brother of the smartphone, the tablet computer, has the capacity to carry a library full of books, the library of the Vrije Universiteit. Fits in an iPad. I mean, that's efficient. You don't need all the paper. You can leave the trees to grow leaves that are so abundant around us at this time of year. But okay, at the same time, the iPad is not just, the tablet is not just a library. It is also capable of hosting meetings. You can talk to people with applications like Skype or similar from Apple. You can talk to people, see them at the same time. You wouldn't have had to come to this meeting to see me and hear me speaking. You could have stayed at home, saved yourself the carbon footprint of yourself traveling here, even with public transportation. It's okay. You can make up for it using the podcast. So the examples show that IT cannot be ignored by policymakers because of the ubiquitousness. We don't want to be ignored, of course not. At the same time, it will not be easy to capture what ICT is doing in regulation. There will be no one-size-fits-all approach. This is just a simple, I took 5 minutes to pick a couple of products that ICT represent. If I took 5 minutes more, the slide would have been so full and so diverse, it wouldn't even be worth looking at. So there can be no one-size-fits-all approach to the challenge. Okay, let's move to carbon footprint. We have an assignment. The European Commission, when making its digital agenda, I think it was back in 2009 or 2010, put the assignment upon the IT sector to commit to a progressive decarbonisation process. This is the part I have to read in my paper because the little text says we have to come up with a measurable and verifiable reduction in energy intensity and in carbon emissions. All processes involved in production, transport, sales of IT equipment and components. Industry, the IT industry, is to develop an auditing and verification framework, assessing whether and how energy intensity and carbon emissions reduction targets will be met by individual companies. So we have a commitment. We have to look at ourselves and make sure that we reduce our environmental footprint, our carbon footprint. So what do we do in return? We set together to go for hard work and we hope for success. We held a lot of discussions, especially in standardization bodies, thinking first of all, how do we measure the carbon footprint of a company? How do we measure the carbon footprint of a computer? How do we measure the carbon footprint of a process, of a service? Yeah, you are probably a subscriber to some TV service. What is the carbon footprint of the TV service? That's a big task. So it took us a couple of years to think about how do we measure this? How can we put the finger on this so we can report on our carbon footprint and we can report on the progress in reducing this? The result that I think we came up with during the past months this year is that life cycle assessment, is another word, is a more broad word than carbon footprinting. Life cycle assessment is a very valuable tool to guide our efforts towards lower carbon products and lower carbon services. So it is useful. We do use it. Our companies, some of our companies use it, some more than others for different purposes. For guiding and prioritization, innovation and development of products and services. And the European Commission, some people in the European Commission, I think, expect us to use this in a way to report, and they expect that they can regulate it. However, then we go on this track. Which direction to take? This is not easy. So many directions to take, and at the same time somebody says good luck, and they say, oh, you cannot go faster than this. So this is the constrained world where we find ourselves if we discuss with policymakers the need to reduce carbon. We are doing it. It is very hard to measure exactly. It's very hard to commit to anything concrete, at least on sector level. Okay. Let me see where I am. Let's talk about things that are possible. Because I just tried to explain what is not possible to be done with LCA and carbon footprint. What is possible? We heard the previous speakers mentioning that the building sector is one of the biggest energy consumers in our economy. You will be aware that this energy consumption can be optimized by smart control algorithms taking into account the presence of users, storing excess energy that is present during warm days in the summer, and retrieving this energy when you need it during cold days in the winter. This has created a number of prototypes of zero energy. We were talking about 95% reduction. We go for 100% reduction. Because this is always possible due to ICT, equipment and algorithms. Just another example. This is the city of Utrecht, in my home country, in the Netherlands. The municipality of Utrecht requested an IT service provider to come up with a solution to reduce the costs and the environmental impact of their operations. Lighting, sewage systems, roads and many more things that are governed by the municipality. They wanted to control this from a secure and central environment and still reduce costs. The IT company came up with a solution that reduced the cost by 20% and reduced the energy consumption by 40%. This is not 95%, but still it's a big step. And I think the project took no longer than 6 months. And it's installed now. This is only one 300,000 inhabitant city in the Netherlands. You can translate it to all Europe. I don't want to talk about this, because this is not green transport. This is a tree on a car. Let's talk about something serious. This is no transport at all. This means this could be us in this room and a few other people who are not even here, watching me on a television screen, talking without having to travel from far away, maybe from Eastern Europe or from Northern Europe or from Southern Europe to the capital of Europe. I think you know that video conferencing systems have been around for a while. At the time, quality was so low that you could use it only once in a while. Many times you decided still to go to see in person the person you wanted to meet. People like business contacts, public contacts and so on. Quality has improved so far that you won't even notice the difference in quality. If you look very well, the difference in visual quality of seeing people on a screen and hearing them through the speakers compared to being with them in a room. So it is becoming possible to skip traveling to a bigger and bigger extent. So transport sector, we can make cars more efficient, but we can also talk about making cars unnecessary for a number of applications and not using them anymore. Very appealing examples if you look at them from a carbon perspective. However, I observe that still a lot of potential of implementing these examples remains unused. Simply because it takes large-scale investment. This is not a cheap system to realize the carbon reduction potential of the smart buildings, the smart transportation, smart cities, smart grids, smart whatever. Conclusions. I've told you that IT, information communication technology, is ubiquitous. It is everywhere around us. It's rapidly innovating, rapidly changing our lives. I wouldn't even know what IT applications look like in 2020, let alone in 2050. It's science fiction. And it's probably different from what we imagine. I think all of you remember reading a science fiction book 10 years ago, predicting how the world would look. Really, just fantasy. Okay, so we have seen at the same time that carbon footprint is a very useful tool to guide our efforts, to steer in which direction we should innovate, how we should create more efficient products, how we should create smaller products. But it is very difficult to put a carbon figure on a product that you can compare with another product, because the uncertainty in carbon footprint results is so big, it's bigger than the differences between products. Those were our findings. Other existing instruments like the Eco-Design Directive, which is addressing products, which is addressing in fact all of our products at the moment, are in place. The Energy Efficiency Directive is in place, addresses our operations, our industrial operations in Europe. I think these are appropriate to ensure that all players on the European market conform to the good practices of innovation towards lower and lower carbon targets and footprints. And finally, I've showed you a couple of examples of IT innovations that are by nature drivers for dematerialization, for making superfluous the use of materials. to the extent that we did. So they are drivers for reduction of energy intensivity and drivers for carbon neutrality. Not just in the IT sector. I showed you an example in the building sector, I showed you an example in the transport sector, and I showed you an example from the city operations sector. So what we are advocating is that innovation here should be incentivized, because real impact can only be achieved by means of structural investments. So I would not conclude that there is a specific policy gap in terms of instruments with respect to energy efficiency regulations. I told you, equally time, energy efficiency directive, they are in place, they are regularly reviewed. You can debate about the speed at which this goes, but it's working. We have policies in place. The real gap, according to me, is in the absence of a policy to realize the full potential of information technology and reducing the carbon footprint of our economy. So there we go. My message is, let's get the balance right between green IT and greening information technology.
Thanks very much, Jos. I don't think you will escape the question that I may pose it immediately, how we get then the potential exploited that you were talking about, with what kind of policy measures, if you are saying there is no gap in these instruments that you mentioned, but there's a lot more potential that we have. So how do we exploit that? Can already think about that, while I think I immediately go to opening the floor for questions to our speakers. There's somebody in the back there. We start there, and we can take, I guess, 2 or 3 questions.
My question is for Mr. Vervold. I take away 2 important things that I heard.
Could you identify yourself?
Sorry, my name is Bart Kastemans, and I'm working as a trainee at the moment in DG Energy at the European Commission. My question is the following. I hear that the milestones haven't been approved, and when you hear members of industry speak about this, they say that because of this, they're putting off investment. Then I also hear that the roadmap isn't at the moment not really maybe reliable anymore, because they're also expecting investments to develop new technologies, because that's how we will get to this increase in energy efficiency. And if you see that the ETS is not working because we don't have the 30% target at the moment, don't you think that the roadmap needs to be changed? Or do you think that we maybe just might not attain this because at the moment, because the ETS is not giving the correct price signals, we're not getting any investment in these sectors?
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We can take a couple more if there's interest. Please, there on the side.
Yeah, my name is David Kainrith. I'm Austrian. I'm also a trainee at the Commission. My question is to the ETS, so it's probably also for Stefan. Now, in the light of what happened in Greece regarding the falsification of economic statistics, do you see there any threat of the ETS being subject to attempts of cheating, attempts of fraud? I mean, especially if the carbon price rises, the incentives for cheating also rise, and there are only indirect ways to quantify the carbon that is being emitted, right? There's no sensor outside the factory to see, oh, how much have they actually emitted, right? That's my question.
Well, they're in the back, and then the lady.
Hi, my name is Jonas Schönefeld. I'm a master's student at Oxford University. I have a question about sort of what was said across the board, which is what is the role of the citizen, the European citizen, of citizens in general, in all of this, in creating these roadmaps and moving policy forward in the future.
Mm-hmm. Can you repeat it quickly?
Oh, sorry, okay. The question is, what is the role of citizens, of European citizens, in moving all of this ahead and moving forward on the roadmap, maybe even EU ETS in general, the policy issues?
Thanks. Perhaps we can take another one and then go back to the panel and then have a second round.
Okay, my name is Didem Büyükerson and I work as an intern at the Turkish Business Association for Transportation and Logistics. And my question is about the distribution of transportation modes, especially for freight, because I think we haven't mentioned it during these conversations. And I know that we have huge differences between the countries, like in countries like Spain or Greece, more than 90% of the freight is carried by road. So what do you think about these kind of differences for transportation modes?
Thanks. Perhaps start with Stefan again,
Okay.
if you want to react.
Yeah, on the milestones, well, what I should say about the roadmap, it was actually, of course, the 2 degrees objective and the objective to reduce emissions 80 to 95% is a long-standing objective. I think even before the year 2000, the EU, the Council conclusion said that. What I think was interesting about the roadmap, that it was for the first time trying to show what it means in terms of technologies, in terms of energy transformation. So it was a way, I think it's like we had for the package, we had a long preparatory process that prepared policymakers, that explained things. The roadmap is also that kind of tool. It is showing what are the important technologies, how the different sectors can contribute over time, all those kinds of things. So I think in terms of the learning process and the maturity of the debate, it's a very important tool. Of course, that doesn't change. It can guide a bit the direction towards, for investors. I mean, energy sector investments of course takes 20, 30, 40 years, and not on the basis of the roadmap, they're not going to take decisions. That's clear. And it's quite clear that they say, well, many of them are saying we need to have clarity on 2030. And that is indeed one of the issues that I think will come up in the future, is to be more concrete on 2030. And well, let's see how that develops. But it's clear that a roadmap is not enough. Let's say. About MRV, MRV is of course key. Well, when I say MRV, that means monitoring, reporting, and verification system in the ETS, and that is the institutional backbone of the ETS. If you don't have that, your system doesn't work. When we are now talking to Chinese experts, China has said that it would set up 5 to 6 pilot systems of ETS. Their first question is, because they are not used to this kind of market-based system, they have trouble all over that they don't know what the regions are really doing. So MRV, monitoring, reporting and verification, is key. If you don't have that, forget about your system working. And that there's a lot of effort has gone into that. You have, of course, a whole monitoring system underlying. You have a reporting system underlying with third-party verification. You have checking by member states. You have a compliance forum where member states talk to each other, how they check data. So a whole system is in there, is in place to have that institutional backbone work. And it's absolutely key. Nobody talks about it, but if you don't have that, you're lost. Fraud, of course, can also happen in other ways, and it has happened in other ways. For instance, in terms of IT fraud, that certain allowances were simply stolen. The registries, which are, because this is like a bank account, everyone has a bank account, operators have bank accounts, and you can have hacking, that certain allowances are simply disappearing. And somewhere else, or appearing in the market, and or being sold, and it can go very quickly. It's all electronically, so you can be sold on 4 or 5 times, and you have to backtrack where it really comes from. Very difficult, all things. So a lot of things we have learned a lot on those experiences. It was also, these registries were run by environment ministries, who are not the first ones who have experience with that kind of problems, but we have put a lot of anti-fraud systems in place over the years to try and prevent those kinds of things. On the role of EU citizens, that's actually a very interesting question, and despite the fact that it is very rarely in the debate, in the end a lot depends on how the stakeholders view the policy. And just to give the example with the comparison with the US, in Europe, when you go to the European Parliament, or when you talk to, or when you have surveys of citizens' opinions, there's no question about the science of climate change. There is a general recognition that something should be done. So the total awareness of the problem inside a democracy is crucial to make these things happen. And we see in the US it's a very polarized debate, starting with the science of climate change. Despite the fact that the Academy of Science of the US is saying exactly the same thing as the International Panel on Climate Change, the fact that this is not yet into the whole picked up by the normal citizens who then can go, and that's actually a very strong situation. And if something is picked up by citizens in the US, it usually is picked up by the policy as well, and that is not yet working. So overall, I would say, although it's quite hidden, a very important role. Question on freight transport, where perhaps we have a bit of a gap in terms of policies relating to freight. That is one of the issues I think we need to think about, and actually we are planning to come out with a communication on heavy-duty vehicles, freight transport, and CO2 emissions, hopefully next year.
Thanks. Jason, you want to react?
Sure, just a couple of things. I think it was Mark who said about the roadmaps, and if they're working in the incentives for investment. There's a difficult situation right now where in the power sector, for example, we've had a lot of investment in renewable energy. A lot of that has been due to this stable framework that you had with European targets, with national targets and support schemes, and we saw huge amounts of renewables going in. Renewables were the majority of gigawatts, of megawatts going into the power sector in the last few years. And right now, we have about 1,700 megawatts of gas being built and 10,000 megawatts of coal being built. So in other words, we're actually going the wrong direction in the power sector, and one of the main reasons for that is that coal's getting cheaper in Europe, partially because it's being displaced out of North America because they have more gas now, and because the EU ETS has such a low price, you don't have any incentive to switch from coal to gas. And so that is a real problem. And one of the rising issues at the moment is this question of, do we need a balanced mixture of policy instruments in the future, or can we just have the ETS take care of everything? And what experience shows us is that that's not likely to work very well, because there's a difference between having good investment incentives to put in place technologies for the future and incentivizing decisions about fuel switching at the margins, for example, or even just about how you what you dispatch into the market. So in future, I think we're going to need both of those things. The question about the role of the citizen, obviously, is something that we are concerned about as an NGO. First thing I would say is that I think there's a mischaracterization about the interest of citizens compared to the interest of politicians. I've already mentioned that the interest of politicians is significantly distracted now compared to where it was a few years ago. But the Eurobarometer surveys year on year, including the special survey on climate change that came out in October of last year, showed that European citizens are deeply concerned about climate change. It was rated second among global problems in severity, ahead of the global economic crisis as a global problem. 8 out of 10 Europeans think that European policy on renewable energy is good or not tough enough, and actually thinks that it would lead to job growth and economic growth. So I think we have quite strong citizen support there if you look at the surveys. And it's not seeming to filter through to politicians, which is why citizens should exercise the great right that they have to vote, because elections are coming up. The European Parliament will be up for election in June of 2014. I'm voting this weekend in my local elections in Belgium. That's a really important opportunity. And what we've done as an office for the past European Parliament election is send out lists of questions that our offices are asking at the national level. Tell me, Mr. Candidate, what do you think about climate change? What are your commitments in that? And I think those are the kinds of things that we should put people on the hook for. And there's all kinds of opportunities to get involved. Again, here in Belgium a couple of weeks ago, there were thousands of people singing for the climate. We didn't organize that, other people did, and that's great. What we do organize is Earth Hour, which it's the largest single social movement in the world. And millions I don't know if it's up to billions, but close to, participate in Earth Hour. And this year it's going to be even more about don't just switch off lights, switch to sustainable energy. So there's lots of opportunities if people use them.
Thanks, Jason. Jos, you want to react,
Yes,
including
just
my question?
2 comments. I will react to your question. I will start with the role of the citizens. Like Jason already said, the citizens have the right to vote. Not just to vote, the citizens will judge us. They will also judge the ICT industry. They will buy our products if they are, not necessarily if they are environmentally friendly or if they are low carbon, but if they are convenient. So what we have to do at all times to make whatever we make, whatever green solution we provide, whatever policy we have to make it convenient. Or if it's not convenient, a citizen will not go for it. I mean, if you look at the value pattern of citizens, I think that like surveys show that like 15% of the citizens have environment very high in their value pattern. It's a big minority, but it's not the majority. So to change society, if we want to reduce everything by 80%, we have to have more than these 15% of people on board. 100% of people go for a convenient product. Why does everybody have a smartphone? Not because it's very energy efficient and long battery life, saving electricity. No, because it's convenient. The environmental impact is a side effect. It is something that the manufacturers and the product developers can take care of. Well guided by the Commission. So that, as far as the role of the citizens, they are our customers, so we try to fix them. Your question was, what is needed to achieve the potential? What is needed? I can give a very simple answer, and I can give a very complicated answer, which is an explanation of the simple answer. The simple answer is, buy our products. It's not so complicated. I told you, we have the solutions. Of course, you need money to buy the products, and you have to understand that these products are good for what we are set out, for reducing climate impact, reducing carbon impact. There's a couple of examples of municipalities and of governments who did this, who made the step to create energy savings, to invest in public transportation, to reduce the emission of, I think, pollutants, mostly fine dust, but also nitrogen. A couple of municipalities did this. They went to great length. It takes a long time. Investments in these kind of structures take a long time to pay back, to realize, and so on. So it takes courage to do this. More courage than you need between 2 elections. Projects to invest in infrastructure take longer than 4 years typically. So what we need is courage to invest.
Well, thanks very much, but sometimes one also needs policies to encourage, I thought. But I'll tease you a bit more. But I'll go back to the audience. There was an arm up there before already, and oh no, we are really into the discussion. Great. So first the 2 here, and then we'll go further. Please.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Lambert, and I work for ICN. I just had a question regarding the role for Europe as leading as a pioneer actually in the whole climate debate internationally spoken. And there are some debates coming up now in the States and in China regarding the EU ETS on actually the block on airplanes, on the whole transport sector. The initial reaction was that we're just gonna, in the States, for example, there was a law proposed saying that you cannot pay the European Commission for flying on their airports. And I was just wondering, there and in China as well, the debate is coming up regarding whether they also want to imply an emission trading system. Do you think that system can play a role in the international debate as Europe as a pioneer actually?
My name is Heike Liebele. I'm an energy policy advisor to the Green Zebra Group in the European Parliament, and I was also impressed by the energy savings potential by ICT, so I just wanted to pick up on this and to see also more concretely in policies. We currently discuss the Connecting Europe facility, and there's like different strands for transport, energy and ICT. And I wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea to earmark a certain part of the ICT money directly for smart grids and all these appliances that would allow reducing energy consumption. If that would be a good idea from your point of view.
Thanks. Then we have, if we can be quick perhaps, then we can take all 3. First in the back, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah, I want to have a question to follow on the question on
can you identify yourself?
Okay, I'm a PhD student in the University of Wisconsin in the United States.
Thanks.
And I want to follow a question on the role of citizens. And so we touched a lot about the role of EU ETS. I just wonder if there's any role for citizens to participate in this market. I know I understand that the design is mainly for the industry to comply with the emission reduction obligation. But I just wonder if the system allows the citizens to say, to buy credits and then for not use, just to retire the credit, for example, as a meaningful participation. Yeah.
Thanks.
That's my main question.
Thanks.
Epper Meeuwissen of UMAPS, EPS installation. I have a question related to the presentation made by Mr. Anderson. He showed the 6 scenarios that were analyzed. And the question to Mr. Anderson and Mr. Vergoten. The 6 scenarios were showed, but what I missed was a scenario combining energy efficiency with renewables, which to me seems a very logical scenario. And now they were only individually there.
Thanks.
Yes, Jeffrey Turkton from KU Leuven, from the Green Economics Institute in the UK, and from the Scientific Research Center of the Sweden Academy of Sciences and Arts. So I have a question that was following up on the one on the ETS system and the role in the global sense. As we know, the EU has always been trying to be a leader in climate negotiations at the world stage, but it's now it's effectively reducing its carbon, so it's actually having less of an impact or weight in that. And even if we completely reduce our carbon impact in Europe, which we're doing fairly well compared to the rest of the world, we have to keep the rest of the world involved in it. And I think there was also the energy climate legislative packet that was the internal thing that was linked to what's happening to this credibility gap that we're worried about. So first of all, is the credibility gap still a problem for Europe? It looks like we're making great progress. Second of all, the ETS as the centerpiece of European climate reduction, how is there progress on actually exporting that model? So there is this, as the first mover and the one that's actually taking this the most seriously, Europe does have an advantage, a first mover advantage in the world stage, and can upload policies. But is Europe actually making progress in doing that? So expanding the ETS, linking it with other ones, and that sort of stuff.
Thanks. Can I invite, especially Stefan, if you talk about aviation in the ETS, to also say a word about maritime transport in the ETS, where there has been for a long time the plan to include maritime transport, which now seems to be postponed, if I read that correctly in the news. And just today there was, I think, or was it yesterday, the news that the IMO again even postponed debate on an international scheme, which raises questions in that perspective. Can I give the floor to you?
On aviation. A very interesting file, of course, because for the first time there was, and you see it actually happening in a number of files, and it's a very interesting development that some of the policies are starting to affect trade, or starting to affect other countries. And that creates a whole new dynamism in the discussions, and aviation is the prime example, where of course incoming and outgoing flights were included in the ETS. And while we explained over and over again that the system as it is today, when you talk about the transatlantic flights, is a few euros, so what are we really talking about? Created a huge upheaval with our major trading partners, the US, China, India. But it has, in a way, triggered a debate. And because why did we actually do the aviation? I think even in 2002 already, the 6th Environmental Action Programme said, well, if by 2003 the international Civil Aviation Organization has not made progress on developing something at global level. The EU will act, and it was only in 2008, basically that 5 years later, that we said no progress, let's do something. So ICAO, as such, was immobilized. And what you see now is that because the system is on the table and because the EU said we are going to do this, that basically ICAO itself saw that they had to take action, that it was their role to have all the countries that are sitting around the table in ICAO, that they had to bring them together. So now we are talking really for the first time, perhaps slow and difficult, but despite all the press releases and what you read in the press, people are starting to sit together on the table and say, what can we do? And perhaps it will not be perfect, but it looks like we are now going into at least the negotiation table on these issues. And that, I think, is a very interesting perspective, that you can have movement in that way. On maritime, we are in a situation that we said as a first step, we are going to go for monitoring, reporting and verification. I said before that this is very important, but I think also on maritime there are special issues there. So it's also important to, especially for this sector, I would say, to put in place a situation that we have all the data on the table. And that is the first step we're going to take. And at the same time we're going to pursue the international, perhaps as for ICAO, IMO is slow, but we are going to pursue that same route to try and do something at global level first. On the question of in how far we have a credibility cap and if we are exporting our model towards third countries, Jason said before that Copenhagen was a failure, and in many ways it was. But still, I think we should be more nuanced about this, because Kyoto was a world where basically developed countries said we're going to do this and the rest of the world was out of the game. And we are, of course, in a world that Europe is 10% of the emissions, the developed world is less than 50% of the emissions, so global action is necessary. Even if we would go to zero in Europe, it won't make much of a difference globally. So yes, that is absolutely vital that these policies have to become more global. And I think since Copenhagen and the pledges, perhaps the 30% was not fully successful, but the 20% and the fact that we as the first region put a pledge on the table forced other countries to say something what they would do. And in that sense, to put the pledges forward, it was successful. And also we see indeed that in a certain number of countries, this is followed by real action. And China, I think, is a prime example. As difficult as they are in the international negotiations, as serious they are in terms of looking at the ETS, looking at clean tech, investing, trying to change the way their growth patterns. So only 2 weeks ago I was 2 days together with Chinese energy modelers, and I was impressed how much they look at the kind of things we have in the roadmap, that they are also starting to develop those models. When can we peak? How can we peak our emissions? So there is a real seriousness, I think, as careful as they are towards the outside world, as serious they are, I think, in terms of looking what they can do and what they can't do. And I think the ETS is now slowly, we have the Korean example that will have an ETS, the Australian example, which is linking to the ETS. So slowly but gradually we see a number of similar systems appearing. Of course it was a big disappointment that the US didn't succeed. That would be a real game changer, I think. Finally, and that's actually linked to the Australian question as well, your question if citizens can buy. Actually anyone can buy allowances and retire them. And in terms of the link with the Australian system, in principle there's not even a need for us to agree with Australia using carbon allowances. As such, they could do that, legally speaking. But of course politically it's much more important that we have this cooperation and that we say you're going for a one-way link, and then as of 2018 we're going to negotiate a two-way link. But in principle any country or any citizen can buy allowances and use them either in the car in an ETS-like system or retire them.
How do we do that? We are not in the registry.
You have to open an account.
Ah, yeah, you see, some difficulties attached.
I'm not an expert in this, I must admit, how to open an account.
It's, I think, not that easy. Jason again next?
Well, just to help you out on the last point, if you go to sandbag.org.uk and click on the Retire Carbon button, they have an account and will retire the number of tons that you buy from them. So it is entirely possible to do that. I tried to open an account, I couldn't figure it out. So the one question that was directed to me had to do with these scenarios, and that was exactly our critique of the Commission's work, which was that you had an energy efficiency scenario, you had a renewable energy scenario, and they actually achieved their efficiencies in two different ways. One was through efficient energy production, and the other scenario was through efficient energy use, so they kind of even out. The obvious question is, what if you combined efficient energy production and efficient energy use? And that's exactly what we've done in our own scenario. So what we are asking the Commission to do is to, and I think it's actually their intention, perhaps Stefan knows more about this as well, is that roadmap will not be the last analysis that they do. They'll revisit the analysis and can come back and see what the implications are of combining those two scenarios.
Yeah. Yours?
Yes, the one question. You asked, can we earmark money from the budget to stimulate smart grids? We can, and I think it's done. We have a DG Connect that is advocating smart grids and connecting all your grids. The bottleneck is not in making the money available, the bottleneck here is in standardization. The smart grid fully operates when every component in the grid talks to every other component in the grid. When you can give energy, when you can take energy when you need it, when not just companies can supply energy to the grid, but also private citizens can supply energy. It helps if I put solar panels on my roof, that not just I reduce my energy consumption, but also I can sell energy to the grid. So yes, it helps to make money available, but first of all we're doing a lot of hard work on standardization. The topic of smart grids is not at this moment within this group, not in the environmental policy group, but in the standardization policy group. That is where the focus is, to make steps ahead.
Thanks very much. We are 3 minutes to 8. That's perhaps time to draw a line, and I would just mention at this stage that I think it was Jason who mentioned that next week we'll actually have then a little bit more discussion about decarbonisation roadmaps and scenarios and what the assumptions are underlying them, and what the policy implications of those assumptions obviously are. We'll then have Adam White of WWF and Stefan Lichtenböhmer of the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy. And obviously throughout the lecture series, if you look into the program, the folders are lying there, you'll see that we'll come back to a number of issues that were touched upon today in more detail. We'll go to the transport and industry sectors, we'll go to the power sector obviously, to energy efficiency, and then move on to some other issues. I asked the maritime transport also because I don't think we will particularly address that. Actually, in the Environmental Action Program, not only aviation was mentioned back then, but also maritime. So there is a basis for taking action. But it's probably fair to assume that the Commission and Member States are slightly frightened by what has happened to aviation and are hesitating a little bit there. Anyway. Thanks for a very animated debate, and thanks for very good presentations and an interesting discussion overall. Perhaps we can thank the speakers by giving them an applause to the end. Thanks very much.